there's stories in the book, and people telling how they feel about, the country now and politics now and Protestantism now, is really and still is affirming for me. I feel that it's provided a space for me and my politics where they are now. It's provided a space for other people who Protestant Unionist people to explain where they are now, but without feeling guilt or shame or the Lundy that's on the front of the book.
Yeah.
Which I feel is really, really important. And it shows, I think, as you rightly say, how things have changed in the last 20 years. And I certainly felt then that I don't feel now, that you were part of a community where you daren't speak out. And it reminds me of campaigning for the Good Friday Agreement and campaigning for a yes during the referendum campaign, when David Irvine and myself and some Labour backbench MPs were campaigning in Sandy Row. And we're walking down one side of Sandy Row campaigning for a yes vote, and Ian Paisley Senior and some of his party members were walking up the opposite side, including Sammy Wilson, and they shouted traitors at us, traitors and Lundys. And David Irvine got so angry, and I remember saying to him, just don't let it bother you, don't let it annoy you. And he said, when you're called a traitor or a Lundy in this country, sometimes it can end in death. He said, and it's not funny. And that's what it was like. If you step outside your community, if you step outside this little thing and express any difference, then no, you don't belong anymore. But the book provides that space for people who feel either that they've separated from the community in some way, or the community have separated for them in some way, to say, no, I'm still a unionist, I'm still from a Protestant background, but here's how I feel about things, and I'm allowed to feel like that. I'm allowed to be proactive. I'm allowed to be pro-choice. I'm allowed to be pro-LGBT. I'm allowed to campaign for rights and human rights and equality without feeling, you don't belong. And I found that really, really good about taking part in the book, because, I suppose my life has become a journey, really, when you think about politics, Good Friday Agreement, PUP, leadership of the PUP, and then retiring from politics in 2011, and thinking at that stage, as I did, that was the end. What do you do next? For 16 years I've been involved in politics, and it really felt like a bereavement. It felt like I'd lost a family member. So along came this opportunity to head up Mary Stopes in Northern Ireland, and I couldn't believe it. I knew it was going to be massive. I knew it was going to be huge. Probably underestimated the level of public interest in it and the pressure involved in it. But I just embraced it with both hands and said, this needs to happen. And as they say, the rest is history.
Well, just should explain to anybody that doesn't know that when you were leader of the PUP, a murder was carried out by the UVF, and you immediately reacted by saying that this was intolerable, that this was supposed to be a thing of the past. But the wider context of it was that a lot of the men who were former UVF people who were now in the party just weren't willing to accept your leadership as a woman. And it's interesting, I think there's recently been a book written about the current leader of the PUP, and you scarcely feature in it. And I just find that really annoying, that women who have made a huge contribution just get written out.
It really doesn't surprise me, because I think I think there are probably those that would prefer to forget that I was ever part of the PUP, because they feel that my agenda, in inverted commas, which was of course party policy and party agenda and everything else around, abortion rights for women in Northern Ireland, equal marriage, all of those things which were voted on at party conference. But I suppose because I was given more airtime to them, because I was campaigning more on those issues than I suppose what had happened previously, that there were those within the party that didn't like that. You know, I wasn't a woman from a paramilitary background. I was never a member of a paramilitary organisation, and therefore I didn't have the background that they had, and probably then therefore didn't have the respect that they had for other men within the party, and that's fair enough. But you know, as David said to me one time, you know, you have to do politics with both hands, and if you find that one hand's tied behind your back, you can't do it. And I found that I had one hand tied behind my back, and I couldn't do politics. And when the UVF murdered Bobby Moffat on the Shankill, I was at a wedding in Donegal, believe it or not, and the phone was out of service. You couldn't get a connection. I think parts of Donegal are like that anyway. And the next day there were 22 missed calls on my phone, and I went, you know, there's something wrong. I knew straight away there was something wrong, and I asked the reception, where's the best place, you know, to get a decent mobile reception, and they told me where to go. And before I got to the corner of the building, the phone started ringing. And the first call was quite nasty. The second call was a journalist, and he genuinely understood that I was completely blown away by the news that he was giving me, that I hadn't known anything. And he very kindly let me have a few minutes to gather my thoughts before he rang me back to record an interview with me, which he did, and I just expressed my horror at what had happened. And I think over the next few days, as the news began to sink in, I realised, and I heard David Irvine's words in my head, you can't do politics with one hand tied behind your back. And for me, the PUP's political project was over. When the UVF killed Bobby Moffat, they killed that project as well. And it was time to go. It was time to move on. And that was difficult, but it was the right thing to do.
But there's a thing that you talk about, that intolerance of women because somehow you weren't seen as being part of the club. And the whole theme of this book is really, in many ways, the whole Lundy thing where you're the outsider, you know. But one of the people that you said that you really liked in the book, Sara, was Claire Sugden. I noticed that you tweeted something about her the other day.
Yeah.
When she talked to me in the book about how when she's an independent unionist who became the Minister for Justice. And she said that she had serious difficulties being taken seriously as a young woman, even though she was clearly a very competent politician.
Massively so. I mean, I read the section with Claire and I just thought, that's politics that I can get behind. You know, and she is the MP for East Londonderry, and, you know, I didn't know that much about her. And reading that section, I was just completely blown away by how sure she was of herself, of her politics, of her identity, and also of the fact that we need to move forward, and the only way to do that is to competently govern Northern Ireland. And she was trying to bring that in and encompass all areas and all sections of the community, and that's what's needed. But I find that our politicians are loath to do that a lot of the time.
I think as well, she has a broader view of what politics is, which I think that both of you have as well. You know, I think a lot of our politicians have a very narrow view of what politics actually is, and unfortunately a lot of commentators and journalists also have that narrow view. I mean, Claire Sugden made it her priority to bring in legislation on domestic violence, you know, and she's very preoccupied with mental health legislation as well. And those things are politics and those things are life, but they're not prioritised. You know, it's always this macho thing of, you know, like at the moment, the talk is all of the Loyalist Communities Council, which nobody had ever heard of before the DUP started meeting with them earlier this year. And yet suddenly they are seen as being somehow, their anger has to be taken seriously, whereas the anger of women who can't get abortions, or the anger of women who can't get a place in a refuge or whatever, is not taken seriously.
And I think you find that when women's voices are absent from politics and policy making and decision making arenas, the policies that are made are never geared towards women and families. But when women are present, it's the policies and decisions that are made are good for all of society and not just one section of it. And we've seen that over many, many years. with different pieces of legislation. You know, we look at budgets, we look at what Westminster turns out as a budget, and who does it impact every year? It impacts women. It impacts the working poor. It impacts families on low incomes. It impacts on people who are women who are single parents because of lack of childcare and everything else, you know. And I think people like Claire Sugden and others like Claire Bailey and you know, they're going to change politics for the better. Whether should it be through private members' bills, which many of them are, but they're still going to change. They're still going to shake things up. And I think, honestly, our political class at the minute need to get out more and listen to what's going on in the community, rather than listening to, you know, the dogs in the street that are barking at them. And I think people certainly that I talk to are more interested in the health service, jobs, training, the economy, how we get back, how we recover from COVID, than they are in relation to any protocol at all.
Yeah, I mean, I did an interview on French TV, and the introduction to it was really telling, because the interviewer said to me, there's a crisis in Northern Ireland, and you know, there are real fears that the conflict may break out again, kind of thing. And I said, no, there isn't. You know, that's not actually happening. There's this talk about this. There's this hype going on, and I think that it was you who said it in your interview, Dawn, that this is what the DUP tends to do when it needs to win an election, is create a sense of panic. You know, and start saying, I mean, Edwin Poots in his inaugural speech as party leader last week came out with the old thing of when unionism's back is against the wall, it'll come out fighting, you know, and just think, why do we have to go through all this old macho talk again? Like, that's not what people were talking to me about in the book.
As David used to say, they'll fight with rolled up manifestos in their hand until the last drop of everyone else's blood. You know, we've seen what the DUP scare tactics have done over the years. I mean, go right back to the mid-1980s with the Smash Sinn Féin campaign. I used to say I wish they'd have smashed the PUP campaign, because we'd probably be the largest unionist party. It was that successful. You know, vote for us or you're going to get a DUP, or sorry, vote for us or you're going to get a Sinn Féin member in the European Parliament. And it was all trying to stop Barbara de Bruyn because you know, they wanted to have the biggest vote. Well, Barbara de Bruyn got a membership at the European Parliament, and the sky didn't fall in. The next thing it was, don't be letting Sinn Féin get all the votes, or you're going to have an education minister. We had an education minister, the sky didn't fall in. And the next thing is going to be, don't vote for anybody else, because Sinn Féin will be First Minister. They'll be the largest party. I think it doesn't work anymore. I think people have begun to realise, and that's why we're seeing poll after poll where the DUP are hemorrhaging votes. People are not going to fall for that old trick anymore. And if Sinn Féin do become the largest party and do become the First Minister, the sky's not going to fall in.
Do you think that Northern Ireland has changed enormously in the last period, Sarah?
I think it really has. I think we have a very conservative older generation, and they're steeped in their religion and their politics, be it Republican or Unionist, and they hold a lot of sway. And I think that the younger generations coming up are much more secure in their identities. I mean, for me personally, the way that I look at it is, I'm more than happy to remain as part of the United Kingdom. It doesn't bother me. A border poll isn't something I'd be looking for. I'm secure in my identity as an Irish woman, whether it be within the UK or elsewhere. And I think a lot of the younger generation are feeling that way. It's like less important to have a stronger union or a united Ireland, and more important to have a way of life and a standard of living here that actually matches everywhere else. You know, we're hemorrhaging our best. The brain drain among both communities is enormous, because what is there here? And our politicians don't seem to be concentrating on bringing prosperity here. It's always about the divisions at Stormont, and then when you go to Westminster, the DUP are just going to do whatever the Tories ask them to. We've seen that time and again, and Sinn Féin don't take their seats. So we've got a very small pool of people who are willing to put their necks out for Northern Ireland. And I think that's one of our biggest problems.
When I was writing the book, I met quite a lot of parents of young people of university going age who kind of said, well, look, if they choose to leave here, I wouldn't blame them, you know. So, you know, people talk about the brain drain, but they don't seem to realise that a lot of it is to do with, there is a kind of a hostile atmosphere here for the young, you know, that there's not a recognition that there's a need to make the place more hospitable.
I remember when Reg Empey was Minister for the Enterprise Trade and Investment, I think it was, and he looked, or he'd done a bit of research, or got, I think it was Joanne Stewart to do a bit of research into the number of students that were studying overseas, and then looking at why they weren't coming back. And it seemed to be that it was young people who'd been to mostly integrated secondary education or Protestant grammar education that were going away and were deciding to stay away. And the reasons for that were many and varied, but mostly because when they got away, they realised what diversity looked like, what equality and inclusion looked like, and that in the whole, you know, the big wide world out there, there were much better, much settled communities. And why would you want to go back to one that is so destructive and divisive and ghettoised? And I think that is changing, and I think it's changing because young people are making those changes more and more. You look at the Life and Time survey, Young Life and Time survey that's done every year around November, December time, and the increasing number of young people that identify as Northern Irish. They don't want to identify as British. They don't want to identify as Irish. They want to identify as Northern Irish because they want this place to work. And that's what the politicians, I think, have failed to see.
Yeah, and one of the things I met in the beginning of the book, as you'll have seen, Sarah, I refer to Lyra, because even though Lyra wasn't from a Protestant background, I kind of realised something when I had known Lyra for quite a long time. So she said something one day, and it kind of made me think, oh, Lyra must be from a Catholic background. And it kind of occurred to me that I had vaguely thought she was a Protestant, but it hadn't really bothered me, and I hadn't really bothered to find out. And I was delighted by that, because I'm of that generation where you always sort of checked, that Sara one now, what would she be? Where did her daddy go to school? Yeah, you know, and various people like Scott McKendry, the poet, told me that his father, who had worked in the shipyard, had a colleague who told him that you could always tell by the back of their necks, you know, and there's all these beliefs that there used to be about how you would tell a Catholic from a Protestant and everything. But it just doesn't matter anymore. I mean, there was a young woman that I spoke to in Derry, really, really nice schoolgirl called Rebecca Crockett, and she was actually, I think, quite annoyed at me because I asked her, you know, were her friends Protestants or Catholics or both, and she said, you know, I don't even know. Why would I know that? You know, I have friends who are probably Protestant, probably Catholic, probably Muslim, maybe none, maybe a mixture of all of those things. But it just, I think it's fantastic about Northern Ireland today is that young people can live here and be interested in whatever they want to be interested in and not feel they've got to say, well, you know, I'm an activist of one kind or another, a Protestant activist, you know, that it just isn't relevant. That's brilliant, isn't it?
I think like social media really helps because it broadens your horizons in a way. You can find your tribe, and your tribe might not necessarily be the people you grew up with or the church that you went to. And I think when we get to a point where we stop identifying ourselves by those really narrow sets of criteria, we'll go a lot further. But I do think like integrated education is the way forward with that, because I mean, I'm 37 and we went on cross-community trips at school. But I mean, aside from that, apart from family members who were maybe in sort of mixed marriages, I wouldn't have seen a Protestant. I wouldn't have known someone who was a Protestant. Everybody I went to school with was Catholic. I lived in quite a Republican area. So that lack of diversity, even just within our own cities, is really, really, it's telling on our generations because we're more bitter than the young ones.
It's unhealthy, isn't it? But like, there's only 7% of people. I mean, integrated education was supposed to be part of the reconciliation project within the Good Friday Agreement, and yet it's only 7%, isn't it? You've written a lot about education, haven't you, and particularly about education and disadvantage for young Protestant men.
Yeah, there's a clear link between poverty and educational disadvantage, and historically, I think within Protestant working class areas, with the history of apprenticeships and going straight into gaswork, straight into shipyard, things like that, it masked an educational underachievement because these boys were able to get jobs, and I think it was I can't remember the man in the mid-80s from the old Belfast Institute had written a paper saying how educational disadvantage had been masked by the availability of apprenticeships. But of course, when those heavy industries close down and there's no apprenticeships available and no jobs available, then you start to see that long tail of underachievement. And I suppose I'd been interested, just as David Irvine had been interested in it, and why the disparity between Catholic boys and Protestant boys, and what was it that was different, and what could we do to try and improve that. And my first year in the Assembly, I asked a question about the educational outcomes in a small area in East Belfast called Ballymacarrat, and I wanted to know how many young people, boys and girls, were leaving compulsory education with the minimum qualifications, 5 GCSEs at grade A to C, and a fifth. After 12 years of compulsory education, only 1/5 were leaving education with 5 GCSEs. And I thought, what are we doing? Something has to give here. And so I pulled a working group together, and we done a bit of research. This thing has been researched to death by now. We know that another report came out yesterday or the day before, and it was a case of saying no more research, time to put this into action now. And there was a whole raft of recommendation, but still it goes on and still it continues. Now, I welcome the report that came out the other day because it said, let's look at early years. There was a recommendation in the report that I produced as well. Let's see now, that the DUP has the ministership of education, if they're going to do something around it, because it's within their gift to do it. An educational disadvantage not only affects the individual, it has a knock-on effect for families, for community, and plays out in domestic violence, criminal damage, young people ending up in prison. So it makes sense, to address that. I remember saying to Gusty Spence one day, Gusty, if somebody come up and said, what makes you a good loyalist? And he says, I've had that all the time. And I says, and what do you say to them? He said, tell them to get their kids educated. Education, 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 education. You want to do something for your community, you want to be a good loyalist, get your kids educated. And he's absolutely right. When I think about my education, which wasn't a great deal, but I was inspired by Gusty and others to return to education. And I was able to do the same for my children. And it's the most important gift that you could give them, really.
Yeah, I think when we had those recent riots in April, they were very minor riots in the scale of things, but it was really sad to see young men getting kind of taught by older men how to make petrol bombs, and then you saw these men sort of standing on the sidelines, clapping them on like they were at a school sports day or something. It was really quite disturbing to see them inflicting that on another generation. And I remember interviewing a teacher in the last book. No, actually, I've interviewed the teacher in this book, but I was on a radio. I met him on a radio program when we were talking about this, because during the Drumcree years in the late 1990s, he was talking about how impossible it was to get young kids to settle into school when they were all hyped up about Drumcree and about being out building bonfires and building barricades and being part of a whole sort of physical force movement in a way, And those things are so distracting for young people, aren't they? And then, of course, as well, there's the thing of young people getting a criminal record as a result of taking part in these things. And it's like if it was in England and it was kind of jihadi groups, you would call it grooming, wouldn't you? You would call it radicalisation. And in fact, that's one of the things that you said in relation to dissident republicanism, isn't it, Sarah?
Without
After
a
Lear
doubt.
was killed.
And I mean, it's something that I think Tony Ogle Johnson mentioned in your book as well. You know, these young people are having their heads filled with the glories of the past, and you can make a stronger union, or you can unite Ireland. And what are they actually doing? You know, they're destroying their entire futures. They're leaving education. There's probably very few of them that have any kind of educational attainment, and they're just ruining their futures entirely. And these men stand back and allow it to happen. You know, their hands might have been dirty in the 80s or 90s, but now they've got somebody else to take the dirt for them. And to me, I think that's very sad, particularly when you think about the possibilities that lie ahead. You know, the way things are going, we could have it really good here. And if you've got a criminal record, that's your entire future tarred. You know, and you're very, very unlikely to come back from it unless you're driven or you have really good support. And I don't think the support's there.
But actually, Tony Ogle she's a fantastic young woman, and to me, she kind of exemplifies that kind of reclaiming of language, which you did a bit of as well, in when you were in the PUP, Dawn. You know, because she came out with this thing where she said her father was murdered by men who are from a loyalist background, and there are court cases going on, so we can't go into any kind of detail about that, but. She has, you know, consistently campaigned for the truth to be told about what was behind her father's murder. And there was a particular thing that she said, which was, if fighting for justice for my father and for my family makes me a tout, then I'm a tout. You know, and I just thought that's brilliant because tout used to be, you know, tout meaning informer. It used to be kind of like the worst accusation that could be made, and I just thought that's brilliant. She's claiming that language for herself, and she's saying, I don't care if that's how you see me. And it's the same with the Lundy thing, isn't it? You know, call me a Lundy if you want, but I'm going to look at it my way because I don't think your way is very helpful, you know.
No, and it's not going to bring about peace in Northern Ireland, you know. We need to invest in our young people. We need to invest in youth work. We need to invest in initiatives that are going to engage young people wherever they are at. And it doesn't matter whether it's out in the street or in youth clubs or wherever it may be. That's where we need to engage, because in building peace, you're not going to get your United Ireland without me, you know, and you're not going to retain your union without nationalism. And the sooner we all realise that we have to come together to make things work, to live together. It's like, you know, I think about John Hume and the stuff that he used to say, you know, and it's really, really important that we do respect each other's diversity and start to live together peaceably. Otherwise, you know, this place is we're just going to wreck it for future generations, and nobody wants that. You know, you look at the young people, you know, they're inspired. You look at the stuff that's going on around this university with the new medical centre and everything else. There's lots of great stuff going on if we could just get the politics right.
And you two are both on the Hume Foundation board, aren't you?
And I think that for me, the thing that I was very passionate about was youth
Young people.
and women. I think because women are chronically underrepresented in Northern Ireland, and they're under listened to. Realistically, like, it's been women who've led most of the peace efforts in Northern Ireland, and cross community, no problem. You know, it seems to be, it tends to always be men. I'm not being misandrous, but I mean the men seem to be very overrepresented and are more bullish, whereas the women have a softer touch and have more of a drive, I think, for actual peace rather than maybe just getting your name in lights.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise too that the Hume Foundation is a John and Pat Hume Foundation, in recognition of Pat's role in you know, peace and reconciliation, bringing about the Good Friday Agreement, but also here in her home city, and the constituency office and the setting up of the credit unions, and you know, there was a woman that led from the front as well, supporting John and everything that he did. You know, they were a partnership, so the Hume Foundation, I think, recognises that. And Sarah's right. When we see the some of the great stuff that goes on in Northern Ireland, you can always scratch the surface and you'll find a woman somewhere behind it.
The theme of what we're talking about this evening is healing. And I thought I might read you a little bit from the book about a young woman called Brittany MacArthur, who I think you might know her, Sarah. You know of her anyway.
I know of
Yeah,
her.
she is a nurse who actually did her training here in Magee in the university here, and she's from Ballykelly, and she came to the world's attention in shortly after Lyra was killed, actually in May 2019. She appeared on this little clip of YouTube singing. She's a nurse, and she was filmed by a visitor in the ward that she was in, and she was just singing Amazing Grace to this elderly, frail lady in a bed. And it was just the most beautiful, ethereal rendition of the song. And, you know, I was like everybody else, sort of feeling quite bruised about Lyra at the time, and it just seemed there was something very healing about it. And it got viewed by thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But when I was doing the book, I thought I'd go and talk to Brittany and get an interview with her, and she turned out to be this just amazing young woman of exactly the type that you're both talking about. So I'll just read you a little bit of it. In May 2019, student nurse Brittany MacArthur sang at the bedside of 87-year-old Nellie Barr in a ward at Altnagelvin Hospital in Derry. She sang Amazing Grace, and her rendition of it was so ethereal, so beautiful, that Nellie's grandson, a local SDLP councillor, recorded it on his phone and shared it on social media. Coming as it did just weeks after the death of Lyra McKay in the hospital, it seemed powerfully healing. I've been singing since I was tiny, she told me. I was Mary in the Nativity play. I learned to read music when I was 3 or 4. I learned to sing and read music by ear. My granny recognised that I had a voice. She always wanted me to take lessons, and after she passed away, I did. I love it. I would have sung solos in the church regularly, though I hated singing in front of people, and I'm still not keen. I get very nervous. I'm a trained classical singer. I taught myself piano, guitar, and ukulele. In school, I played cornet and euphonium. I learned the ukulele in half an hour. I learned things practically by doing them. And my comment on that was, she lists her talents, not boastfully, but in a matter-of-fact way. I was born in the Altnagelvin Hospital, and now I work there. I sing at work on a regular basis. You'd be surprised how much it helps, especially with dementia, she said. That particular day, I was working in a 31-bed ward, and it was an elderly lady who wasn't well. I'd never met her before. I just sang for her. I didn't know it was being filmed. I went out on my break, and there were all kinds of messages. Her grandson thanked me and said, I hope you don't mind me sharing this. I hate attention, and I nearly died when I saw the video and saw it had 10,000 views. It was shown in America, Australia, Canada. The Derry Journal had it, the English papers and the TV. There were over 140,000 views of the original and 181,000 when it was on Fox News. I got an approach from an agency in England, but I'm far too self-conscious to sing professionally. Anyway, it would take the fun out of it, and I want to be a nurse, not a singer. I was brought up to respect other people's views. Like I call the town Derry or Londonderry, whatever. But at work I usually ask them what they prefer, because some people do take exception, especially if someone has a head injury. Mum's dad was from a mixed family, half Protestant, half Catholic. Dad was a Protestant. I was brought up Church of Ireland. I was a worship leader in church. I moved to a more contemporary church recently. It's non-denominational. I grew up in Ballykelly, which was very definitely a community sort of place. Doors were never locked. We lived in a cul-de-sac, and there were lots of children, so you just played out. Ballykelly Primary School was very mixed. We had army kids from the barracks, and I was friends with some of them. A family from Slovakia moved in, and I'm still in touch with the girls. It makes no odds to me what religion anyone is or where they're from. It doesn't come up. I honestly never think about it. You're still a person, regardless of your religion. I don't see why it matters. And, you know, that's exactly what we've been talking about, really, isn't it? Just a really open-minded, good person. Yeah. And she goes on to talk about how she was involved in the nurses' strike and everything as well, and how the whole health thing. I mean, health is hugely important to people here, isn't it? It's one of the main reasons that people cite for saying they would rather stay in the Union than be united with the Republic of Ireland, which doesn't have a public health service free at source. You work in the health service, don't you, Sarah?
I work in the health service, and I took part in the strike as well. It is massively important, and we do have a lot of health issues in Northern Ireland, both mental and physical, and a lot of it does stem back to the conflict, and there's intergenerational trauma, and there's things that are passed down from mother to daughter and father to son. But I mean, that would be one of my main reasons for wanting to stay in the Union is the NHS. I think that the Republic doesn't have anything remotely near it.
Even though it's quite broken down, and even though it's in crisis.
Oh, I mean, it is in crisis, and I think that's one of the biggest disgraces that successive governments have let down the NHS, and they have sold it off, and they've underfunded it, and it's run as a business. And there's something to me that just feels really immoral about health as a business. When you look at America, I'm sure that's the model maybe that they're looking at, where people make millions. But I mean, I think most people who go into healthcare don't do it for the money. They do it because they have a genuine want to help people. So I mean, I think that's something that realistically we do need to fight for.
I think our issues in the health service have been here for a long time. Prior to devolution and then post devolution, and then our kangaroo, stop-start devolution since then. And what was really interesting about the New Decade New Approach was the commitment by all parties to prioritise health. And most recently, when we had the Nuffield report around the extent of our waiting lists, again, all of the parties have said that they will prioritise our health service. These are issues that aren't going to go away, and we need the politician to wear what we'd call their big girl pants, to make these decisions. We've had the Bengoa report, we've had various other reports, and we all know, the Royal College of Surgeons came out recently, we all know what needs to happen. We need to see hospitals specialising in, regional centres for this, that and the other, and not having, wanting to have every service available, within 10 minutes of your doorstep. That's what needs to happen in a country this size with a population the size of the county of Lancashire. There's just, and we need to realise that. And I think there are some really bold decisions that do need to be made if we do want to treasure and have a fully functioning health service that we all desire. I still think, I think Protestants in particular really fear the United Ireland for that very reason. Health service, even though it's broken at times and even though it doesn't function correctly, but it's still the health service. It's still free at the point of access, and that's what's really important.
Do you think, like in Derry here, is there? It seems to me that in Derry, of course, being from Derry, I think Derry is where everything gets sorted out, but it does seem to me that certain things have been sorted out in Derry, Sarah, like the apprentice boys thing. Lundy is still burned every December, but and Lundy was the traitor and all of that. But this time when I was writing the book, I went to watch the burning of Lundy, which I don't usually go to see because I generally find it a bit sort of disturbing. But this time around, it really didn't feel very threatening, and I think a lot of that is down to the fact that there has been a lot of healing, reconciliatory work in Derry, really hard work that went on, particularly when Martin McGuinness was here. And actually, it's interesting that Claire Sugden talked about Martin McGuinness as being one of us. She identified with him as, somebody who grew up in Northern Ireland, shared the same kind of background as her. He just happened to be from a Republican Catholic background, where she was from a loyalist security force Protestant family. But, she... Sorry, I've lost my train of thought now, having gone off on that little digression. But, Derry and the Apprentice Boys and Lundy, the Bogside Residents Association, which is largely made up of people from the Catholic areas outside of the walls, and the Apprentice Boys have worked together really, really carefully and long and hard over the years to have a dialogue, which means that they now have the Lundy thing without it being a big flashpoint. I mean, there used to be inevitably almost trouble.
Yeah.
And nobody would come to the shops, even though it was just before Christmas and the businesses needed the trade because the Lundy thing was on and it was all going to get ugly.
Yeah.
But it doesn't anymore. It really has become part of the fabric of the city. And there was Kenny McFarland from the Londonderry Bands Forum is in the book, and one of the things that he said to me that really stuck in my mind was people just want ordinary politics here. You know, they're really sick of all the tension and all the sort of divisiveness and all the rest. They just want ordinary politics. And he was talking about how his kids, he grew up in new buildings. He would have been a Protestant on the city side in Derry, whose family ended up during the Troubles having to leave the city side because it just had become intimidatory and impossible for them to continue to live where they were living. And the family went over to new buildings in the waterside. But he said his kids now would come home from playing in a band or band practice or whatever, a loyalist band, and they'd get themselves all dressed up and they'd go out to Waterloo Street in the Bogside to listen to Irish music, you know. And Catherine Pollock, who's a young community worker in Derry as well, she said the same thing. She's bringing up her kids. She works in the Bogside. She lives in the Fountain Estate, you know, the two denominations background there. And she said that she doesn't want her children, who are little children at this stage, to have to choose between one or other of the Derrys, you know, the Derry or the Londonderry. She wants them to feel that they can have both, you know, and that's fantastic, isn't it?
It shows you what can happen through dialogue and understanding. And the City Centre initiative with Brenton Duddy and Gordon O'Doherty, you know, bringing people together to talk, to break down, you know, the ignorance and the misinformation and everything else, because what they've did is really transformed the city. They've opened it up and made it available for everybody, because it is everybody's city. It's not, doesn't belong to one side or the other. It belongs to everybody, and it's the same. You can relate that. If we could do what happened in Derry at a bigger scale for Northern Ireland, would have cracked it.
100%. And I think it is. It always comes down to the same thing: bringing people together. Once you bring people together and you realise, and I mean, as I said to you from reading the book, I mean, there are so many people in the book that I identify with. Their politics are my politics. The only difference we have is how we identify in terms of our nationality. But I mean, it just shows you we're kind of split into these two camps, and there aren't two camps.
There's not.
There are hundreds of camps, and no two of them are the same. And I think that's the thing. We need to be more integrated. We need to speak to each other more. We need to learn that being other isn't a bad thing. You know, and that's a big problem I think Northern Ireland has. We view other as suspicious and trying to take things away from us, whereas reality, we all just want equality. You know, and if we all have the same rights and the same sort of availability to speak and be heard and feel heard, which I think is a big problem here. We don't feel heard because our politicians don't tend to represent the man on the ground. They represent the party and the party lines. And I think that is a big problem because we're not represented properly and we don't speak out enough about it.
But I mean, I felt when I was writing the book, like I'm often struck by the way that particularly, say, the media in the Republic of Ireland tends to sort of go, when they have to do a northern story, they go for a very small pool of people, you know, and it's almost like they don't know that there's a big, huge population of people up here to choose from. And I didn't have any difficulty finding women to speak. I didn't have any difficulty finding non-binary people to speak. I didn't have any problem finding kids to speak, you know. I mean, some of the people who I think are brilliant in the book are young people who are part of a project called the Monkstown Boxing Club in North Belfast. And there was one boy called Didi, and he had almost crashed out of school because he had Tourette's and he just had all kinds of problems, and he just thought he couldn't cope when he'd gone into depression and stuff. And then he got referred to the Monkstown Boxing Club, where they gave him sort of a lot of one-to-one support. And he had been able to go back into education and he'd been able to do his exams, and he was now coming back into the club to talk to other young people, you know, and it was just brilliant, you know, to see a young boy who had thought that he was nothing, and suddenly he actually now had the confidence. He said that when he was in school, he sometimes spotted another boy who he thought was depressed, and he sort of had seen the signs, and he would just go over and sort of say, "Are you feeling okay?" or you know, are you all right? Or what are you doing after school or whatever? And, you know, get that kid to talk to him. And I thought that was fantastic. That's transformational.
Plays back onto your
Yeah.
point about educational attainment
Yes.
and making young Protestant boys feel like they can achieve things, and that you know their horizons are endless. They're so broad, but I think that we all feel pigeonholed a lot, you know, and it seems to be the way of things.
And I think, talking about the media, that's what the book does. It provides that space for those stories, whereas media nowadays, it has to be instant, it has to be social media. It doesn't allow for that more in-depth research and analysis that goes on, and the book provides that for a lot of us.
Well, I think we've run out of time, so we'll stop at that. But it's been a great privilege to talk with the two of you about the book, and I'm so glad that you've both been enjoying it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Buaitlim farú na fáilte a chur romh an seo go campus Fagee, agus hiig an chuid cheolmhar don chógail Veracánach de léon na hÉireann. Magee campus is home to a melting pot of musicians in various genres. We are now delighted to present students and associates of the university as they share with us the best of the Irish tradition. To begin, we have two current students from our Traditional Music Society, harpist Mairead Comer and percussionist Moya Sweeney on accordion. This will be followed by world-renowned traditional flautist Marcus O'Murrough, beautifully accompanied in song by his wife Katrina and their daughter Roisha, who is recognised as one of the finest young singers in Irish of her generation. Finally, we have a breathtaking performance from the fiddle player Eugene McKenna and harpist Lauren O'Neill. Our former student Eugene has grown up steeped in Irish music and is a member of the award-winning Blackwater Ceilidh Band. Current PhD student Lauren has established herself as a world-class performer and exponent of harp music, having performed in Aras an Uachtaráin and been the subject of a BBC documentary about the shared musical heritage of Ireland and Scotland.
agus bhar sláinte isteach a loch fechanna tá fáilte romh ag an chúlóir a chun do chuide ag go muidinis an aici le níl muid bhádháil scoil bh gaí atá reachtal seminar ítach táhaach ar a gúglas de híide í ruachtaran ar éireann agus tá cóthárlainn sin bhí se anóg mar gúglas nar a thola sin bhélig níos sa teach deach ministere mar bhí san ahar ach nar a bhóg an tathair go cilbheith a tránaí airtir bas ar muir héna gan dích ligi much an le bella ha farnain much my Cartland agus o Conlún agus Magarada agus tá muid go henim seo manín Róise agus tá muid go henim couple tún a bhaine initiatív sin tíre an céad cean slán na sligach Purvis sligach agus sinna muid seo an ómas do Googlas de híide. ítach an críbhín íbhín agus bhí ansam go deoige in sna hórain agus an dhéalaíocht dús chuir se spéisiins na hórain a bhí feicilbh a tranaí an chuilsin de clígach ar bheits an watcher an aclamáiste na bhuaile ach ní é sin chuisir fud chanacht agus bhhaile se agus chuir sé glóiad an chuig áirin grás chuig a chanach mar hampla na measc agus tá go le ceáil óran as chuig galú ó an grá gal an téna chéarna bóchal an airne agus chuirí maníon ráise tús leis. Ni bos bread ham en severgolor. Stam corgi a veder aider glamis giron. Smart in the basin and there on the way. Raching na maraching an lame van chwil. Gan chwetje gan ba gan granin bracher bilam. Adel na greu mar Julia post moiam. Solo hat man jergus de fech sharon al. Buchja bom leon klapnisherio. Agimmerts the gol the hovre jasset fadlio. Malchaime mostor ni doi charchaime motiel. Es ni molten de fonen vroker daar chayule blien. Achus de stor na pose shaman yelia. A pose farok molio O bet to go for the gano, Damakustorium. Sahel and George from known Martin Gotram. The Grammy might have a look fechan a tomagical oran as condaigure, oran a collar, listen a caddy blian. Agus is oran jassé, Cajation and Chashin and Chanimiter, Mavan, Kayla, Katrina and Shaw, Manin Rasha, Agus Mahan, Marcus and Murray, Hasarangar, were much in Kuru, Old Skulvagi, the Shaw Yanu for Wargonias, more Pleasure Aid Institute, Googles the Hija, Agus Graham Rach J or of Gadair.
Me conne di sil me mo gwe van daar get any weos ma holden terges ma vram pantor og Jason dan Jason nach met den da ma holden terges ma vram pantor og Jason dan Jason nach met Shindo. My him quill great washing his made and now crow when you that they got no at all. My him shall lose every cranny and so. O Jason, done Jason, Nachman Shindo. My him shall lose every cranny and so. O Jason, done Jason, Nachman Shindo. My him she garnel a sprinkle sport. Again, I'm not a silk renewed and short. Ma chindini sugas ma viam sudalo. O Jason, done Jason, Nachman Shindo. Ma chindini sugas ma viam sudalo. O Jason, done Jason, Nachman Shindo. Jardini go well megan ravis gan doi. Gan nare do gan bolat na stor. Ma tamishes as the mohoni agro. O Jason, done Jason, Nachman Shindo. Ma tamishes as the mohoni agro. O Jason, done Jason, Nachman Shindo.
Reminder.
1, 2, 3.
Díodíobh agus de fáilte romh a lig an seo ag an ócaid speisialta seo. Hello everybody, and you're very welcome to this very special online celebration of music. My name is Lauren O'Neill and I am a harper and researcher here at Ulster University, and I've just been joined by Eugene McKenna on fiddle from Ahur, County Tyrone. I hope you enjoyed that first piece of music. We began there, especially for this conference, with two pieces which were composed in America. So the first is a composition of Billy McComiskey's, and that hornpipe is called The Plain of the Plank. And then we followed that with a slip jig composed by the great fiddle player Liz Carroll called Rose and Kathleen's. We're going to move on now to a set, and I'm going to begin by playing a harp air. So this air is called Bonnie Portmore, and there's words to it as well. It's a song, and it was collected at the end of the 18th century by Edward Bunting. Edward Bunting was a famous collector here, particularly in Ulster and Connacht in Ireland, of lots of harp music, and he also, along with other scribes, transcribed words that went along with the harp music itself. So this piece of music was taken down from a harp player from County Derry called Daniel Black. And it's amazing that we can look at these manuscripts and create our own interpretations of the music that was played so many centuries ago here in this county itself. We're going to continue then with three jigs. The first is called Jerry's Beaver Hat, and the second is called the Stig Jig, and it's composed by a great guitar player, John McCartan. And then we're going to finish with a Scottish tune composed by the great fiddle player Chris Stout called Inksters. Disúlagam go munhishiv saltas.
Thank you very much, everyone. We're now going to finish up with a set of reels. Before we play, I would just like to thank everyone for listening in tonight, and of course a big Gura Mai Hagat to Malachy O'Neill, Neil Comer and the Irish department here at McGee. We're going to play 2 reels now. The first reel is called Paddy Kenny's Toast, which is named after the great fiddle player Paddy Kenny from County Clare. Then we're going to play another reel called Bill Hearts, and Gura Mila Mai Hagaf a leg a richt as fe Jacqueline Nacht agus Amor Arth.